Greetings, Padawan. We are going to talk about women writers during the American Romantic period. So, on your screen here, you can see our good friend Margaret Fuller. We're going to talk about her. So, you probably haven't heard a lot about a lot of American Romantic women, and that's because there hasn't been a lot written about them until recently. So, remember that history is written by the victors and by the men. So, that's not a slam on men or the victors, but that's who usually writes the history. And so for a long time in the literary canon, that's like this imaginary but not imaginary slate of everything that you're supposed to read within each genre, right, each time period of literature, women weren't included. Margaret Fuller stands out as the most recognizable of the American Romantic women because she was the editor of The Dial, which was the transcendental magazine. She lived in and around Concord and Boston, which is where a lot of the activity was taking place. She identified, of course, as a transcendentalist. She was part of the Transcendental Club. There are letters, lots of letters going back between her and Thoreau and mostly Emerson. And so, she's definitely part of the movement. So, because we tie a little bit of everything that we do to the British movement, Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She was the mother to Mary Shelley, who is the author of Frankenstein. And she was a British Romantic writer. So Margaret Fuller wrote a tract for women, American women, about life in the 19th century, women in the 19th century. So she was talking about women's rights and because remember, women didn't have the right to vote. Women relied exclusively on the men in their lives to support them. And so there were a lot of writers during the American Romantic period, women writers, but we haven't heard of many of them. We don't know a lot of them. The folks that we do know about, the folks we do hear about, the women we hear about, are usually abolitionists. So some names you might have heard of, Lydia Child, who was a very prominent advocate for children's rights and anti-slavery rights. She was an abolitionist. She was an influencer to Margaret Fuller, inspired her. She, advocated for racial and religious tolerance, especially coming out of the Puritan tradition. She founded a private school for girls, as did Henry Thoreau and his brother John, and Bronson Alcott. She published the first journal of fiction for children, something like Highlights magazine today, and she wrote the first anti-slavery tract. So she was very active. Lydia Child was very active and very influential to people like Margaret Fuller and to some other advocates. But they are largely, Lydia Child is not often thought of in terms of her being a literary figure. She's more considered a political figure, which is interesting because someone like Emerson or someone like Thoreau is considered more of a literary figure than influencing the political realm. So that's kind of interesting how they kind of mix it up for men and women. She edited Life of a Slave Girl, which was written by Harriet Jacobs in 1861. You might have heard of her. She was an ex-slave that wrote about and condemned the sexual exploitation of slave women, and was contemporary with Frederick Douglass. Again, political figures, not necessarily literary figures, though they did write. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott were the two ladies who came up with the Seneca Falls Women's Convention, and again, considered political figures, not considered literary figures. And they were, of course, out to get women the right to vote. Harriet Beecher Stowe, which wrote the most famous book in the 19th century, which was Uncle Tom's Cabin, was an anti-slavery text as well. And again, we don't ever think of her in terms of literary means. We always think about her in historical means. So it's interesting that there were lots and lots of women writing, but the canon of literature didn't include them. They kind of pushed them off to the political realm. You've heard of Sojourner Truth, right? She was a slave in New York. She spoke Dutch, and she told her story to promote the rights of slaves. And then the first African American woman to publish a novel in the United States was Harriet Wilson. But interestingly, she didn't publish it under her own name. And what we find with a lot of these writers is that they don't publish under their own names. They assume pen names. And that's so that they wouldn't bring shame upon their families or wouldn't bring harm to themselves because the climate was so difficult. So the two that we're left with, there's three really. Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women, is a daughter of Bronson Alcott, who is a very big part of the Transcendental movement, very big part of the American Romantic movement, political figure, writer, philosopher, thinker, started a school for girls. She was his daughter. So she was growing up during the American Romantic period. So we don't necessarily... Not everybody considers Little Women a romantic text. I do, because it has a lot of romantic elements in it, and some of her other writing does as well. So I consider her a romantic writer, so she is definitely worth taking a look at. But remember, she was a child growing up during the Romantic period. So the two that we're left with that we know that we, say these two women are American romantic writers are Margaret Fuller and then Emily Dickinson. So, as I said, Margaret Fuller edited The Dial. She taught in Bronson Alcott School, so Louisa May would have known her. She was one of the first female literary critics. Emily Dickinson, who is an interesting character, she was definitely a rebel. When you hear about her, you kind of get this painted picture of this, very meek and, mild woman who did shun society and wanted to be buried in white. And there was a rumor saying that she only wore white, but that's not actually true because she talks about other dresses she owns. But, like this fading flower locked in a room. She was actually quite a rebel. She refused to get married. She didn't like people. She preferred to write to them, so she didn't want to see them. She would bake. It's one thing I read says she would bake bread and she would tend the garden, but she wasn't going to dust. She wasn't going to go visit people. She just didn't want to deal with people that way. So she wrote letters. She wrote letters to her neighbor, which was her brother and sister-in-law. She wrote letters to everybody around her, and she wrote lots and lots of them. She published her poetry, which is very nature-inspired, and she had a great education in botany and in the natural sciences. But again, she penned a lot of that not in her name. Right, she didn't publish under her own name. It said that her father was very domineering, which is also, true of Bronson Alcott too. That he was a very overpowering influence in the lives of his children. But she was not a fan of traditional punctuation. Even though she went to church well into her 30s, she called herself a pagan. She wrote about science over nature, even though that's not typically a romantic thought. Science could also be, in this sense, called nature. She talked about nature over religion. She never married or had children, and she just preferred to write to people. She didn't want to talk about them. She didn't want to talk to them. Again, she didn't publish under her own name. So we have all these women characters. And but the ones that right now the research and the discovery is going on. We're trying to lift some of these writers out of sort of the dust that exists wherever they rest, and we're trying to make sure that historical figures, Beecher Stowe and Harriet Jacobs and all the different abolitionists get their due credit on the literary side as well as the historical side. So I love reading about women during the 19th century. I love reading about the stories about women. I'm very fascinated by Hawthorne's writing about women and his stories in the Blithedale Romance, his treatment of Priscilla, his treatment of Zenobia. So it's interesting to see how people write about women when they're not women, and to see how women write about men when they're not men. So, so hopefully you'll be interested in what you are reading. So those are your notes for women writers.